The story the Western press is telling about the US blockade of Iranian ports is a story about leverage, about coercion, about a superpower applying economic pressure until a rogue state capitulates and gives up its nuclear ambitions. That is the frame. That is the version you will find in almost every major outlet covering this conflict. It is the wrong frame. The more consequential story, the one that has been almost entirely absent from mainstream coverage, is not about what the blockade does to Iran. It is about what the blockade does to the United States, what it costs, what it commits, what it cannot undo. There is a category of military action where the side that executes it bears costs that are not immediate, not visible, and not priced into the original decision. The US blockade of Iranian ports is that category of action, and the gap between the official framing and the operational reality of what a blockade actually requires is the story that nobody is calculating. To understand what has just been committed to, you need to understand the situation into which this blockade was inserted. In the space of 6 weeks, the United States conducted sustained airstrikes on Iranian air defense installations, destroying an estimated 34 radar sites and 11 surface-to-air missile batteries across the western and central regions of the country. It carried out targeted strikes on 4 of Iran's senior Revolutionary Guard commanders, including the Deputy Chief of Strategic Operations. It destroyed the Fordo fuel enrichment facility, or at least the portions of it accessible to bunker-penetrating munitions. And it absorbed in return 3 separate Iranian ballistic missile salvos involving a combined total of approximately 214 missiles, a significant fraction of which penetrated US and Israeli air defense screens and struck their intended targets. That is what the situation already was. That is the level at which this conflict was already operating on April 12th, the day before the blockade was announced. Into that situation, the United States has now inserted a new and qualitatively different kind of military commitment, one that does not end on a predetermined timeline, does not have a quantifiable success condition, and does not scale down without a political decision that nobody in the current administration appears prepared to make. Iran's coastline is not a peripheral geographic feature. It is one of the most strategically complex naval environments on Earth, and before any analysis of what a blockade costs to enforce, it is worth understanding precisely what that coastline is. Iran has 2,440 kilometers of coastline across 2 distinct bodies of water, the Persian Gulf and Arabian Sea to the south and west, and the Gulf of Oman connecting to the broader Indian Ocean to the east. It is not one coastline, it is effectively 2, separated by the Strait of Hormuz and the Musandam Peninsula of Oman. This matters because a vessel leaving the port of Bandar Abbas, Iran's primary commercial port, handling roughly 70% of the country's container traffic, exits through a different choke point geometry than a vessel leaving the port of Chabahar, Iran's only deep-water port on the Indian Ocean, located approximately 720 kilometers further east, outside the strait entirely. Chabahar is not incidental. Iran developed it specifically as a strait-independent export corridor. India has invested more than $500 million in its development and holds an operational contract through 2053. A vessel clearing Chabahar does not pass through Hormuz. It enters the Gulf of Oman directly and is beyond any blockade that is defined as a blockade of the strait itself. This is why the US Central Command clarification issued on April 13th was so operationally significant. It specified not a blockade of the Strait of Hormuz, but a blockade of all maritime traffic entering and exiting Iranian ports, all ports, including Chabahar. Enforcing that boundary requires not one naval perimeter, but 3. One at the northern entrance to the Persian Gulf, one along the Arabian Sea approaches to the strait, and one at the open water approaches to Chabahar and the ports east of it. The US Navy is not blockading a choke point, it is blockading a coastline. Those are fundamentally different operational requirements with fundamentally different resource implications. There are two interpretations of why the Trump administration chose this specific action at this specific moment, and it is worth being precise about both of them. The first interpretation, the one the administration is implicitly offering, runs as follows. The US has destroyed significant portions of Iran's air defense architecture. Iran's nuclear program has been degraded but not eliminated. Diplomacy has failed to secure the only outcome Washington requires: a permanent, verifiable renunciation of nuclear ambition, not just capability. The blockade is therefore a coercive mechanism designed to impose such severe economic pain, $2.2 billion per month in lost oil revenue at current prices, that Tehran concludes further resistance is irrational. Under this interpretation, the blockade is a pressure tool with a clear, if demanding, goal, and the administration believes Iran's domestic economic fragility makes it viable. That interpretation has surface coherence. Iran's economy contracted by an estimated 4.7% in the prior fiscal year. Inflation is running above 43%. Foreign exchange reserves are under meaningful pressure. A successful enforcement of the blockade would accelerate all of those dynamics. The logic is, hurt them enough, and they negotiate on your terms. But there is a second interpretation that is harder to dismiss. The second interpretation is that the blockade was announced not because the administration had calculated what full enforcement would cost, but because the administration needed to demonstrate escalatory momentum after peace talks collapsed. Under this reading, the blockade is not a pressure mechanism. It is a signaling mechanism designed for domestic and regional audiences, not for operational outcomes. It says, "We did not accept a bad deal. We escalated. We are winning." The problem with signaling mechanisms used as substitutes for strategy is that they still require enforcement. An announced blockade that is not enforced is not a signal of strength. It is a signal of bluff, and in a conflict with Iran, Russia's interests, China's energy dependencies, and India's infrastructure investment, all sitting in the operational theater, a demonstrated bluff is more dangerous than no announcement at all. The most plausible strategic logic, stated plainly, is that the administration committed to an enforcement burden it had not yet fully calculated. In a theater where every point of contact incident carries escalatory potential that extends well beyond the bilateral US-Iran dynamic. The cascade is not a prediction, it is already the operational design of the theater. Iran has not responded to the blockade announcement with a military strike. That is not because it lacks the capability or the will. It is because a direct military response to a declared US blockade is the response that the US is best positioned to absorb and counter. Iran does not optimize for direct confrontation with American naval assets. It optimizes for asymmetric pressure in domains where attribution is contested and retaliation is politically complicated. Iran has, at minimum, 3 categories of graduated response available to it that are more dangerous than firing on a US destroyer. The first is mine deployment. Iran has the world's 3rd largest inventory of naval mines, including pressure-activated and influence-triggered variants that do not require Iranian personnel to be present at detonation. Seeding the approaches to Hormuz, the Gulf of Oman shipping lanes, or even the approaches to Chabahar does not require Iran to fire on anyone. It simply makes transit so hazardous that commercial insurers suspend coverage, which is functionally equivalent to a blockade without Iran bearing the military cost of enforcement. Lloyd's of London and the Joint War Committee have already elevated the entire Persian Gulf to their highest war risk classification. The threshold for insurance suspension is not destruction. It is credible threat of destruction. The second is proxy activation at scale. Iran's network of proxy forces across Iraq, Syria, Yemen, and Lebanon have not been fully committed in this conflict. Hezbollah retains an estimated 150,000 rockets and missiles in southern Lebanon. The Houthis have demonstrated the capacity to strike targets throughout the Red Sea corridor with sufficient accuracy to materially affect global shipping traffic. A coordinated activation of even a subset of these networks does not constitute an Iranian military action that can be attributed clearly enough to justify a direct US strike on Iranian territory in response. It creates escalatory pressure in multiple theaters simultaneously with diffuse attribution. The third option, and the one receiving the least coverage, is energy architecture targeting. Saudi Arabia's Ras Tanura terminal processes approximately 6.8 million barrels of oil per day. It is 250 kilometers from Iranian territory and well within the operational range of Iran's Shahab-3 ballistic missile system, which carries a payload sufficient to destroy refinery infrastructure. Iran has not struck Ras Tanura, but the calculus changes materially when Iran's own oil revenue has been reduced to zero by an enforced blockade. A country with nothing further to lose from escalation is not constrained by the same deterrence logic as a country still managing its economic exposure. The financial arithmetic of this blockade is not complicated, but it has not been assembled in one place in most coverage. Iran exports approximately 1.8 to 2.1 million barrels of oil per day at current production levels. At $103 per barrel, the approximate price at which Brent crude was trading on April 13th, that is between $185 million and $216 million in daily oil revenue. Over a 30-day enforcement period, a fully effective blockade deprives Iran of between $5.6 billion and $6.5 billion in revenue. That is the number the administration cited when announcing the blockade, and it is accurate as stated. What that number does not include: Iran holds approximately $4.1 billion in foreign currency reserves held through channels that are not directly exposed to port enforcement barter arrangements with China denominated in renminbi, gold holdings outside the SWIFT system, and deferred payments from customers who will simply extend credit rather than lose a supplier. The effective cash flow disruption will be severe. But the claim that it is immediately existential overstates the short-term coercive leverage. On the US enforcement side, the numbers are less frequently cited. A carrier strike group operation, a single carrier, its air wing, its escort cruisers, destroyers, and submarine support costs approximately $6.5 million per day to operate in the theater. The U.S. currently has 2 carrier strike groups deployed in the region, the USS Harry S. Truman Group and the USS Carl Vinson Group. That is $13 million per day in carrier group operating costs alone, before accounting for the additional surface combatants, maritime patrol aircraft, P-8 Poseidons conducting surveillance of the Iranian coastline, and the mine countermeasures vessels that Trump has explicitly ordered into theater. A realistic estimate of the total daily enforcement cost runs between $24 million and $31 million per day. Over 90 days of enforcement, that is between $2.2 billion and $2.8 billion in operational expenditure, and unlike Iran's oil revenue, this cost is incurred regardless of whether any Iranian vessel is intercepted. The 90-day figure is not arbitrary. It is the approximate outer boundary of what a carrier strike group can maintain in theater before requiring a rotation cycle that creates a brief but real enforcement gap. The administration has not publicly addressed how that gap will be managed. For Iran, the object of this conflict is not oil revenue. Oil revenue is a variable. The object is institutional survival, specifically the survival of the clerical structure that has governed the country since 1979. Nuclear capability within that framework is not a bargaining chip. It is an insurance policy against the possibility that a conventional military defeat could result in regime change. The calculation is not economic, it is existential. For the United States, The object of this conflict is depending on which official you consult and on which day denuclearization, regime pressure, regional stabilization, or demonstration of resolve to allies in the Gulf. All of those are strategic objectives. None of them is an existential one. Throughout the history of asymmetric conflict, the side for which the stakes are existential has demonstrated a consistent capacity to absorb punishment that the side fighting for strategic objectives cannot politically sustain. That is not a prediction. It is a pattern recorded from Vietnam to Afghanistan to the 3-4-day Lebanon War of 2006, in which a non-state actor with Iranian-supplied weapons fought the fourth largest air force in the world to a documented stalemate. The asymmetry between existential and strategic motivation does not resolve through additional pressure, it compounds it. Every additional month of conflict that fails to achieve its stated objective strengthens the existential interpretation on Iran's side and weakens the domestic political case on Washington's. Subscribe to this channel right now if you are not already. What we are doing here is the financial and operational accounting that the headline coverage skips. We are telling you what the blockade actually costs to enforce, what Iran's real response options are, and what the global energy market implications are before most analysts are even framing the question correctly. That is what this channel is for. Hit subscribe and let's keep going. The second and third order economic consequences of this blockade have not fully materialized yet, but their architecture is already visible. Brent crude moved from $88.40 per barrel on April 11th, the day before the blockade announcement, to $103.17 on April 14th. That is a 16.7% move in 72 hours. For context, the invasion of Ukraine in February 2022 produced a comparable single-week move that was sufficient to add approximately $0.42 per gallon to U.S. retail gasoline prices within 30 days. A sustained blockade with credible enforcement at current price trajectory would push retail gasoline prices in the United States above $4.80 per gallon nationally within 6 weeks. In California, where refinery margins and state tax structures compound the national baseline, that figure approaches $6.40. The political implications of that number are not abstract. The 2026 midterm elections are 7 months away. Every dollar at the pump is a political liability that compounds against the party that owns the conflict. The administration is aware of this dynamic. It is the same dynamic that constrained U.S. policy in Ukraine when fuel prices became electorally visible. What is different in this case is that the U.S. is not merely adjacent to this conflict. It is the party directly enforcing the blockade. The political cost of fuel prices cannot be distributed to a foreign war. It attaches directly to a policy decision with American authorship. China imports approximately 1.7 million barrels per day from Iran through arrangements that bypass U.S. sanctions through third-party intermediaries. A genuine enforcement of the blockade that intercepts Chinese-flagged or Chinese-chartered vessels creates a bilateral confrontation with Beijing that the administration has not publicly addressed. China's foreign ministry has already issued a statement characterizing the blockade as a violation of international maritime law. That statement is not legally decisive. The legal status of a declared blockade under UNCLOS and the laws of naval warfare is genuinely contested, but it establishes the diplomatic context in which any Chinese vessel interception will occur. The administration must either enforce against Chinese tonnage and absorb the diplomatic cost, or create a visible enforcement carve-out that renders the blockade's coercive effect structurally incomplete. India presents a similar problem. Chabahar is an Indian economic project. India's External Affairs Ministry has not endorsed the blockade. A U.S. vessel boarding an Indian-chartered cargo ship departing Chabahar does not create a military confrontation. It creates a diplomatic rupture with the world's most populous country, a nation Washington has spent the better part of a decade cultivating as a counterweight to Chinese influence in the Indo-Pacific. The blockade does not distinguish between these relationships. The enforcement calculus must. Here is the analytical conclusion that the evidence supports, stated plainly. The United States has committed to an open-ended military enforcement operation against the full coastline of a nation of 88 million people in a theater that includes the strategic and economic interests of China, Russia, and India, without a defined success condition, without a stated enforcement duration, and with a coercive objective permanent nuclear renunciation that the target government has never agreed to in its 4 or 5-year institutional history. The blockade is not a sign of winning. It is a sign of a conflict that has not been won through the instruments applied so far, and in which the escalatory next step was chosen not because it is more likely to produce the desired outcome, but because the alternatives accepting a limited nuclear agreement or continuing an air campaign with diminishing marginal returns were politically unavailable to the administration at this moment. That does not mean the blockade will fail. Coercive economic pressure has produced agreements before. It means the blockade's probability of success is not a function of naval power, which the United States has in abundance. It is a function of political endurance, specifically whether Washington can sustain the domestic, diplomatic, and financial costs of enforcement for longer than Tehran can sustain the economic costs of being enforced against. That contest has not yet been decided, but it has begun, and the evidence supports the conclusion that the administration entered it without pricing in what it would actually require to win. The prediction worth recording now, as a matter of verifiable future accountability, is this. Within 45 days of the blockade's enforcement, at least one non-Iranian flagged vessel, whether Chinese chartered, Indian operated, or registered to a third-party neutral state, will be intercepted or diverted by U.S. naval forces, and the diplomatic response from Beijing or New Delhi will force a publicly visible modification to the enforcement criteria, not an end to the blockade, a carve-out. And that carve-out will be the first visible signal that the blockade's coercive completeness has been compromised. Watch for it. What is being negotiated right now is not Iran's nuclear program. That is the stated object. The actual negotiation is over a more fundamental question. Whether the United States can convert uncontested naval supremacy into political outcomes against an adversary that has spent 4 decades building its strategy, specifically around the assumption that the US will eventually apply that supremacy. Iran designed its entire strategic posture around the moment the US Navy shows up. It prepared for this. The proxies, the mines, the redundant export corridors, the barter arrangements outside SWIFT, none of these are improvised responses to a blockade. They are the architecture of a country that anticipated one. Military power and coercive leverage are not the same instrument. The US has the first in quantity. Whether it has assembled the second is what the next 60 days will determine. Leave one question in the comments before you go. What is the one development, one specific event that you think would force the administration to modify or end the blockade? Every response gets read. I will address the most substantive ones in the next script.